Robin comes on?
What's that?
Didn't you say sometimes Robin comes on?
Yeah.
Cardinale?
Yeah, definitely. Okay, let's get started. Okay. So you can put that aside for a little while. The sheet, I was referring to the sheet. You can never put aside
She could look each one of these up.
the Tanakh, yeah. So this is a presentation of the Sabbath. When I first began preparing this, I didn't think that it would be all that interesting because, I've studied it, and I didn't think people would be that interesting. But I think that one could devote an entire series to simply the study of the Sabbath. Oh, someone's coming online. Sounds like it anyway.
Does that mean the doorbell or that?
No, I think it came from here.
How was the doorbell too?
Oh, maybe, because nobody's coming online here. It looked like somebody was signing on.
It sounds like a doorbell.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Getting a little bit of a late start today.
I've been trying to advertise you, you saw that.
What's that?
I've been trying to advertise you.
I know you have, and I appreciate
I'm gonna
it.
have to be like the British, I'm like press gang.
I'm dedicated to finishing the series, so, there's a ways to go yet. I think we'll only get through the Sabbath, this session. No? Okay. Anyway, so I'll begin again. We could devote an entire series to simply the study of the Sabbath. It is complex in its theological design as well as its purpose, as we'll see. The Sabbath in our tradition is arguably the most important and most likely one of the most ignored days in terms of understanding its purpose, and I would suggest that its purpose of the Sabbath is twofold. The first is to leave the world alone for one day. Allow nature to renew itself, and likewise for all creatures, sentient and non-sentient as well. The second is to create a sense of holiness, sanctity, which in turn allows us to appreciate our true selves and the world in which we live in. So it has those two functions. Now, before we delve into the biblical passages, which we will very shortly, it is important to understand that this is only one interpretation, and some may in fact disagree with my explanation and the lessons that I draw from it. So if we turn first to the sheets that I've just handed out, we look at Genesis 2, 1-3, where the Shabbat is first mentioned. This is the first reference to the Sabbath in the Bible. The heaven and the earth were finished, and all their array. On the seventh day, God finished the work that had been undertaken. God ceased on the seventh day from doing any of the work. The reason that's an ellipsis is because in the Hebrew, Vayechal Elohim, well, it's really God. God ceased on the seventh day. And God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, having ceased on it from all the work of recreation that God had done. That's a very common, everybody pretty much knows this. So to get an understanding of how the rabbinic tradition or how the Jewish tradition began to view the Sabbath, we get to an underlying theological principle, which I'll come to in a moment. A Midrash poses the question, why did God rest? In typical Jewish form. Is it possible that God got tired? No, of course not. It is to teach us that God ceased from God's labor of creation, then how much the more so, teach us that if, I didn't say this correctly, if God ceased from God's labor of creation, alachat kama v'kama, which is a Talmudic phrase, which means then how much the more so, alachat kama v'kama, how much the more so, should humanity need such a day? Okay. Well, the next question is asked, well, how did God bless the Sabbath day, and how did God make it holy? The response is, God lit candles, recited his blessing, and made Kiddush, which is the recitation of it's an extended blessing over the wine, and which includes sanctifying the day itself. So to this day, regardless of denomination, Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, we recite these same blessings over the candles, the wine, and the day itself. You go into an Orthodox home, they'll say exactly the same blessing. You go to a conservative home, it's exactly the same. You go into Reform, it's exactly the same. We recite those blessings when we begin our service and when we end our service. So what can we draw from this midrash, from this passage and minhag, this custom that has gone on for millennia? The particular midrashim occurred no later than the 9th century and probably long before, 4th or 5th century. In rabbinic literature and understanding of the Torah, God is personified as a teacher for, and this is Jewish logic, if God, who is almighty and in need of no rest, nevertheless rests and makes holy a particular day, again, then how much the more so should we, who are human and live and die, must rest and create holiness. And also, God in the Torah-itic text, by being personified in this way, is teaching us something about the human condition. God isn't per se a teacher, but the way God is described in the sacred text, one could conclude that this personification, this giving God human terms, lighting candles and saying Kiddush, is a way for us to imitate God. There's also a psychological dimension to this in the Jewish tradition regarding the Sabbath, and that is acting as if our work is complete as the Sabbath approaches, because God finished all of his work by Yom HaShvi at the moment of the seventh day, and then ceased from creating on that particular day and rested. And again, the Jewish tradition teaches that the work of creation was finished to teach us to do the same, to consider that when we enter the Sabbath, to consider the work of the week completed. In our society, which is driven by achievement, rest is a very difficult thing to do. I.e., we used to have blue sky laws, as some of you may remember. Right? Now, nowadays, so many stores are open 7 days a week, and that involves human beings who must work on the designated day. Not only some must work, but also many choose to work. Later in this presentation, we'll define what constitutes work, such that such activity might constitute, we'll come to it, a violation of the Sabbath. So far, nothing has been commanded about keeping the Sabbath. All we have is a description about the first Shabbat, the first day when creation, in the sense of how things are formed, were created by God, that the work of creation on the part of God was complete. So far, so good? Yes, please.
If you look at the universe,
Mm-hmm.
and we always talk about the universe expanding, is that the work of completion?
A theologian would argue completion in the sense of setting things in motion.
Okay.
Having a sense of completion with regards to now things are set and are unfolding in the physical universe, at least, the way physics has been set up initially by God. As Einstein once said, when asked, well, who is God? God is the man behind the clock. That was Einstein's definition.
And I always talk about the big...
I mean, don't ask me if I understand what he meant by that, but it has to do with,
I think I do.
Yeah, time
time.
and our
He's
relationship to time.
outside of time. If this sheet of paper is time, God's over here.
God is in time
He's
and God is
here,
outside of time.
he's-
Right.
If
God
it's
is in time and God is eternal. When time ceases, in the universe, God will still be there.
Yes.
Mhm.
That's the psalmist's understanding of God. Yeah.
But that's the whole question, if there was a Big Bang, who set it off?
Exactly. Again, science doesn't dispute
Lit the fuse.
whether there is or is not a God. It just can't be proven as to God's existence, God's being, God's presence. That is something that is not provable it can't be demonstrated as a proof like the laws of physics can be proven to some extent,
Some extent.
or like a mathematical formula that's proven to be true. Okay? So now let's go to Exodus 20, verses 8 through 11. And perhaps this is one of the most famous passages. It is here where the Sabbath is commanded to the Israelites at Mount Sinai to remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Now, what is odd is that I used AI to get some sense of the dating of this particular chapter, and I think AI is actually wrong here. And despite many tries, according to AI, it seems that the date is between the 15th and 14th century, and I put down when was Exodus 20, what is the dating for Exodus 20? And I kept getting the 14th and 15th century. And it noted that this is the current thinking of some scholars. And that's very early. When I was in rabbinical school, we dated the actual Exodus, not the writing of the Exodus narrative, at around 1250 BC. But I suppose the thinking has changed somewhat. But it's hard for me to believe that the dating commandments is that early, in the 14th, 15th century BCE. Moreover, if we are looking at the redaction of Eve, if we consider this part of the Elohim passage, it would be around the 9th century, which we shall see later on makes more sense, just in terms of the documentary hypothesis theory. Now, if you look at the various cultures of this period, the 14th, 13th, 15th century BCE, Code of Hammurabi, the Sabbath seems to be a unique creation of the Israelites, our ancestors. You don't see the way that the Sabbath is laid out as an ordained day of rest in other cultures of this time period. So regardless of whether the Ten Commandments were given at Mount Sinai or not, the creation of the Sabbath day seems to be unique among the cultures of the Mesopotamian and Egyptian area. So if you look, so here you can see in number 2, and I've highlighted, I've bolded those areas of the commandment that I want you to focus on that seem to be an addition from Genesis 2:1. And Genesis 2, the dating, again, is, it might even be later, because it's considered maybe 8th century BCE, but maybe they're contemporary, I'm not sure. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. That's in bold, because you have the word zachor, remember. That's not in Genesis 2:1. There's no commandment there. We're not commanded, humanity is not commanded to do anything. Now it goes on, but this is, now we get a commandment. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the 7th day is the Sabbath of your God, and you have Adonai. You shall not do any work. You, your son or daughter, your male or female slave, or your cattle, or the stranger who is within your settlements. For in 6 days Adonai made heaven and earth and sea and all that is in them, and then rested on the 7th day. Therefore Adonai blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. You see that? Okay. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is that in Genesis you have the word Elohim, not Adonai. And here you have Adonai. Okay? It's kind of just another, but the first thing to note, the second thing to notice is that is that it is a command. We are commanded to do something. Remember. And then these are the things you cannot do. Right? You can't cause anyone to do any work for your benefit. If you have a slave, if you have an animal. And the rationale for all of that goes back to Genesis 2:1, right? But the tone, of course, is much different from Genesis, as Judaism, in the words of the author, capital A or small a, is beginning a new covenantal relationship with the Creator God, in which God commands by law, mitzvah. And this perspective is also somewhat new compared to other ancient cultures where the grant of authority, for example, if you look at the Code of Hammurabi, the introduction, is given by the gods to the ruler to make such laws. Hammurabi could make laws, but there's no claim that the laws that he is making are of divine origin. In other words, Hammurabi is blessed by the gods to make the laws. And if he makes the wrong laws, then people will know because the God will punish. Here what you have is God making the laws and human beings are commanded to follow. It is a different paradigm in great part. That's a major difference between Judaism and the surrounding Mesopotamian, the Middle Eastern cultures in that period, yes.
Is it interpreted for the benefit of his people, the Jewish people?
Is what interpreted for the benefit?
But that God would do it for the benefit of his people, this command is...
Yeah, that's a good question. Are the Ten Commandments, or the notion of a commandment, actually for the benefit of humankind? Who is to benefit from this? That's a very good question. I would posit that it's for our benefit. I mean, the basic theology, is that God doesn't make laws to hurt people. God makes laws to live a better life. I think it's Moses Mendelssohn who posited that the purpose of the Torah is to shortcut how to live the good life. That we could come to it on our own through reason, but the Torah becomes a shortcut for that. Now, some people can obviously argue with that because there are things in the Torah that are, in our culture, somewhat problematic, and somewhat problematic in terms of our own human sensitivities.
But if you took it Hammurabi, it was a despotic kind of a command, where...
Yeah, but Hammurabi is the one making the laws.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, right. And so you could say, well, he may be blessed by he may have the authority from the gods, but he's the one making the laws, whereas God's making the laws for better. And this is where you can get into some extremely sensitive and problematic verses, that do not speak to us today, that seem harsh, and seemed harsh in earlier times that were, I'll theorize, were softened by quote the rabbis, the Sanhedrin, the development of this oral law that we talked about earlier. Okay, so let's go on a little bit. And now we come to Deuteronomy 5, verses 12 through 15. And again, I've emboldened those things that to me stand out. Right? So, the Ten Commandments appear twice in the Torah. The first is in Exodus, then at Deuteronomy 5, verses 12 through 15. And there is a contrast between the two formulations. Notice the bold, observe the Sabbath day, keep the Sabbath day, and keep it holy. You don't have the word remember, you have the word keep. As your God, Adonai, has commanded you. This part seems to be very similar, if not exact. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of your God Adonai. You shall not do any work, you, your son, or your daughter, your male or female slave, your ox or your ass, or any of your cattle, or the stranger in your settlements, so that your male and female slave may rest as you do. Now we come to a different rationale. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and your God Adonai freed you from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. Note the difference. First, the passage in Deuteronomy uses the Hebrew word shamor, which means observe, more literally either keep or safeguard. Whereas in the Exodus passage, it is zachor, remember. Different tone. Second, the rationale has changed from one of theology. Remember the Sabbath day as the time when creation was completed, and that there is rest in the universe which is to be honored. Right? God made the universe in 7 days, that's what you should remember, and therefore as a remembrance of creation, everyone and everything gets a day off. As a remembrance of creation. To one of which one might call loosely, in today's language, social justice. The commandments are somewhat identical in terms of who is to rest and who must be given rest, but the reasons differ substantially. The reason behind Deuteronomy, the reason behind the commandment here is one of empathy. Because you know from your own history how much suffering you endured in Egypt by having to work as a slave. Do not treat your slaves or anyone in this fashion. That's a major departure from the rationale in the Exodus passage. You see that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the Sabbath as an individual becomes, in part, I'm being anachronistic now. Do you know what anachronistic means? If you don't, it's okay. It took me, I didn't know it for a while. And I think anachronistic, correct me if I'm wrong, somebody who knows, is where you take a term like social justice and you say, oh, this is what this means, and the text is written at a time when the word social justice doesn't appear. In other words, we're taking a construct or a value that's very famous in our generation, social justice,
And applying it back.
and then we're applying it back in a time when that word or that term wasn't even thought about. Or maybe we're drawing that as a kind of construct to which we connect. So we always have to be careful about that. But I don't think that it's unfair. I don't think it's unreasonable to suggest that there is a social justice element here. Because you remember how you were slaves. Slavery is not just the cessation from work is not just for the sake of God, it's for the sake of society. We're going to let you have slaves and animals and all of that, but they have to rest as well, and they can't do anything for your benefit. We'll talk about that probably in part 2. I'm not sure we'll get to part 2. Yes, please. Any comments you want to make on this, of course.
In India or in Southeast Asia, don't they have a tradition because they use, for example, elephants.
Uh-huh.
They work them, but they rest them one day.
Do they?
To
I see.
keep them from they'll run crazy. They'll run amok.
Yeah, I didn't see anything to that, and I am not an expert anthropologist at all. And if that's the case, then
I think even the
yeah, and that's probably been going.
circuses.
It's maybe
The
Hindu
circuses.
culture, or is that?
well, I think even the circuses that were in the United States,
They rested
where
them.
they had to rest in particular the elephants a day.
Yeah. So even there's a relative of ours, the elephants, mammals, they're in that classification.
A very intelligent.
And so all sentient and non-sentient, having a conscious, are supposed to rest. And you're not, and you can't tell even a non-Jew to go work the animals and claim that you're not. If you own the animal, then you're responsible for giving it rest. And you can't delegate work to somebody else and claim, well, I didn't make the order. And you're not to derive benefit from that, from somebody else having to work. Okay. Now that gets interesting. Keep that in mind when we talk about what constitutes work from an orthodox or very traditional point of view, because we will talk about that. Okay. So the Sabbath, as I said before, is as an individual act of social justice, i.e. rendering everyone equal in terms of having a day of rest that extend to the prohibition of causing anyone or any animal to work for your benefit. Okay? So there is an equality there, and there is a recognition of the human condition because of what you endured, that you cannot make another group of people endure what was loathsome to you, what was an extreme hardship. That's different. The Exodus passage, the Deuteronomy passage is different. And interestingly enough, the Deuteronomy passage is late, right? If you remember the JEPD theory, P being 8th century, 7th century, Deuteronomy passage is 7th century, around the time of Hezekiah, maybe 722 or 650. I think it's closer to the 7th century BCE.
It was around the time of Hezekiah.
Right, exactly, Hezekiah's reform.
Yeah.
So we have a different, if you're going to look at it from a documentary hypothesis theory, a gradual progression of conceptualization of the Sabbath from being a remembrance of creation and rest to the rationale changing to one of social justice later on. That's developing a social consciousness that's not as apparent in Exodus 20. So far, so good?
So good.
Interesting. I found that when I began to really look at these passages closely and began to look at historical context. Now, I want to take one other passage, and that's Exodus 31, 12 through 18. And this passage is a curious one, for already we have the commandment to remember the Sabbath and by extension to observe. Perhaps more so than the passages just cited, this one is probably the most relevant. And as you can see, I bolded everything to show just how different this conceptualization is than Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. Speak to the Israelite people and say, this is God saying to Moses, nevertheless you must keep my Sabbaths, for this is a sign between me and you throughout the ages. Now you have a timelessness, right? Le'olam really means forever. They translate this for ages, but the word le'olam means really forever. That you may know that I, Adonai, have consecrated you. There is a particularism here. I, God, have consecrated you, the children of Israel. You shall keep the Sabbath, for it is holy for you. One who profanes it shall be put to death. You don't have anything in Deuteronomy about that, and you don't have anything in Exodus 20 about that. Whoever does work on it, v'nichleta me'ameha, that person shall be cut off from his people. They're from kin, they have it among kin. But it's really from, I think, to me, me'ameha really has a reference to people. You're going to be cut, if you don't keep the Sabbath, you're going to be cut off from your people. 6 days may work be done, but on the 7th day there shall be a Sabbath of complete rest, holy to Adonai, this concept we've had. Whoever does work on the Sabbath day shall be put to death, mot yumat. And we can talk about what that phrase mot yumat means. We'll do a little. In the Talmud, in this oral law, the term mot yumat doesn't necessarily mean, it does mean shall surely be put to death, but how do you institute that death penalty, or what constitutes proof that you have violated the Shabbat is very, very difficult. As I said before, you have to have warning by 2 witnesses, and then the same 2 witnesses have to observe you violating that commandment. So for example, if I see you working on, if I warn you about working on the Sabbath, and I go my merry way, and it turns out that you worked on the Sabbath, that's not proof that you worked on the Sabbath, and you cannot incur the death penalty. Also, there's, and of course one can argue, rightfully so, that violating the Sabbath shouldn't at all, lead to the death penalty. And one can argue that this is meant as a metaphoric phrase. In other words, that you shall surely die means that your spirit, your soul, will die if you don't observe the Sabbath. That's more of a reform, more liberal interpretation. Mot yumat is, I believe, the infinitive absolute, and that means shall surely be put to death.
Sheol,
But of course they,
Yeah.
Sheol,
What's that?
would it be Sheol?
Yeah, end up in Sheol.
Yeah.
But Sheol in biblical phrase doesn't mean like a hell, it means go down to your grave. I mean, that's how I understand it. Sheol is that place after death that doesn't reference heaven. You will go to your grave. It's that kind of force and effect. I'll go down to my grave mourning, like when Jacob says, I'm going to mourn the death of my son to Sheol. I read that the same as when we say, I'm going to go to my grave, lamenting or whatever it is. I'm never going to recover from this.
of course, they had the example of the first one that was put to death because he was picking up sticks.
Yes, that's in Numbers, a very, very problematic verse. And it's interesting because they're troubled, they don't know what to do. And yet they've been told what to do. They've already had the passage about being put to death earlier. Okay. The Israelite people shall keep the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath throughout the ages as a covenant. Now the Sabbath has become a covenant. It is a sign of the covenant between God and the Israelites, later on, of course, the Jewish people. And it's for all time. Whether they're in Israel, whether they're outside of Israel, no matter where they are, the Sabbath is a sign of the covenant. So now it has covenantal status, which is different from doing various mitzvot and commandments. The Torah is being very explicit here. For in 6 days, we've seen this before, God made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day God ceased from work, and now we have a new word. I should have underlined it, and was refreshed. Vayinafash is rested and renewed. I mean, we could go into a whole thing about that, but I don't want to do that. But just note that that's a new word that does not appear, okay? And upon finishing speaking with him on Mount Sinai, God gave Moses the 2 tablets of the pact, stone tablets inscribed with the finger of God. And this is the last verse prior to chapter 32, the part about upon finishing speaking, okay, which detailed the construction of the tabernacle. The interesting thing here, I think, just if we're going to look at the source of these things, is that you have different conceptualizations of the Sabbath, of the Shabbat, running throughout the Bible. These are 4 different passages. And this, and God ceased from doing all the work that God had done, right? That's the end of Genesis 2, verse 3. But here we have Vayinafash, we have an added word, and was refreshed. Okay? That's not in the 10 Commandments. I don't think it's in the 10 Commandments, and it's not in Genesis 2. And it's not in the 10 Commandment description in Deuteronomy 5. So you have a little bit added word there that is interesting for us to think about. Now, this is the last verse. These last verses, 12 through 18, ends that chapter 31. And chapter 32, and this is important, it's not going to seem important at the moment, but it is important, details the construction of the tabernacle. When you get to chapter 32, you're going to see they go into great detail about how to construct the tabernacle, and that's very important. Okay. So I want to just review just a few things, and that is The first is that instead of the focus of the Sabbath being a time for observance, it now becomes part of Israelite Jewish identity and peoplehood. No matter where you're Jewish, the Sabbath is a forever sign between God and the Israelites, and that is eternal. The covenant between God and the Israelites are eternal, and the Sabbath in particular is is a sign of that eternal nature. So the Sabbath, now we've had social justice, we've had commandments, and now it has a theological component that is unique to the Israelites. And note, of course, the severe penalty, as I said before. Unlike the earlier and later versions of the Ten Commandments, they don't say anything about that. The last portion, the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath throughout the ages as a covenant for all time. This particular passage, the last bolded one, is part of the liturgy in all three movements and is recited on Friday night before the most important prayer of our liturgy, which is called the Amidah. I don't want to go into that too much. That's where we stand, we petition God, and we thank God for the Sabbath. We do it silently. On Shabbat morning, we repeat. And this prayer, the V'shamru V'nei Yisrael, is found in both the Friday night and the Shabbat morning. I'm pretty sure that it is in the Orthodox and the Conservative. I can double check that to make sure. So it's said really two times, one in the evening and one in the morning. As an aside, when I was in rabbinical school, a professor of liturgy, the late Zichrono Livracha, may his name be for a blessing, Rabbi Jacob Pedakovsky, said the reason for that is so that this passage would not be forgotten. If you put the Ten Commandments in, everybody knows the Ten Commandments, and one related to the Sabbath. But here, this is not such a famous passage. I would suggest that not only that, but it has a different tone to it. It has a different emphasis. It's not, it has a command aspect to it, you shall, but it's not, more importantly, there is a deep spiritual rationale. There's a spirituality in this description of the Sabbath. Zachor is a cognitive remembrance, if you want to look at it that way. Shomor is a doing. But here, it being a covenantal relationship description, it is a more spiritual and hence becomes a greater part of Jewish identity, a significant part, unlike the other holidays, yes.
It kind of like it moves from your intellect to your soul, down to your heart.
Yeah.
Is that the way you would describe it?
Yeah. There's a spirituality, and we'll talk about that probably for sure in part 2. Probably for sure, that's an oxymoron. Right? That makes no sense.
Sounds
Probably
good.
for sure. And I'll close this section with a Jewish journalist, an essayist, Zvi Hirsch Ginsburg, primarily known by his Hebrew pen name Achad Ha'am, which means one nation. He was a Hebrew journalist and essayist and one of the foremost pre-state Zionist thinkers. He said, more so, he is known as the founder of cultural Zionism. What is cultural Zionism? Herzl's idea of Zionism was land-based. Ginsburg argued that the Israelite people, in terms of Zionism, is a culture, is a people that transcends land, and that you can't have a land of Israel without people having this strong Israelite or Jewish identity. And his focus was on the identity. And this quote will I think, bear that out. He was born in Kiev in 1856 and died in 1927 in Tel Aviv. He actually lived in Palestine before the creation of the state. he once wrote, and I think there's great truth to this, more than the Jews keeping the Sabbath has kept the Jews. So whether one is Reform, Conservative, or Orthodox, each in their own way, Jews are at a minimum mindful, not necessarily observant all the time, of the Sabbath. And it is always there, I contend, regardless of the level of observance. When a Jew goes out and has a good time on a Friday night, that Jew knows that it is the Sabbath and knows that somewhere in their consciousness, in their heart, that, it's the Sabbath. I won't mention guilt or anything like that, but most every Jew is aware. I'll give just a little social commentary. There's this TV program, what's it called? No One Is For This. I don't know if you've seen it. It's on Netflix. It's a story about a modern-day rabbi who's engaged to a Jewish girl who wants nothing more than to be a rebbitzin, and he feels something is missing in his life or in their relationship, and he breaks it off, and he gets invited over to someone's house for dinner, and there is a non-Jewish woman who's very, very modern and they start talking, and they kind of are attracted to each other, as people who are different are attracted to each other, and they start to date this rabbi, right, of a conservative congregation, and the rabbi, she shows up at a Friday night service, sits in the back, and he's of course happy to see her, and he says, just wait out there 15 minutes for me, I'll be right out. And of course 15 minutes with the congregation. First of all, you don't do that as a rabbi. You don't rush out of you got to be with your people, you got to be with the congregants and be social. You can't put that kind of time pressure on yourself. But he does. It's TV, right? Right. So he goes out and he goes out to a restaurant, and many congregants do that. Okay, in Reform Judaism, many people after going to services, instead of having Shabbat dinner, which is very traditional, they will go out to a restaurant, have a nice meal, and so forth and so on, and that's their way. He's going out on a date. He's at kind of a bar-type restaurant, and he's a rabbi on top of it. So he knows, that. But it's Hollywood, and they don't focus on that too much. Mm-hmm. But a rabbi that would go out and do that, I'm not commenting on the dating at all. I mean, the heart goes where it goes, and you've got to work that out. And the much of the series is devoted to that. But the lack of self-consciousness is apparent. Lay people may have one standard, and I'm not Orthodox, so I want to be clear. In that description, there should have been a little bit of, I know it's the Sabbath, but there wasn't that. We'll talk about going out to restaurants on the Sabbath. For many Reform Jews, it's perfectly acceptable. For conservative, in theory, not so much, but many would do that. And then finally, I'm just making social commentary. I'm sure if this gets posted on YouTube, I'll get some responses. Orthodox would never consider that, and I'll talk about the differences why. Yes?
Did the conservatives always have a set Seder meal?
Yeah, in most conservative homes, yeah, that's absolutely true. They will have a very short, one of the great differences, and we'll talk about this later on, between Reform and conservative. Mm-hmm. Reform service is mainly on Friday night. The main service for Reform Jews is on Friday night. Shabbat morning is, in fact, we don't have Shabbat morning services, except once a month. It's not in the Reform tradition. Whereas conservative Jews, they will have a very small service, usually on Friday night, so that people can go home and have the Friday night dinner, the Sabbath dinner. Think of Fiddler on the Roof, exactly. Right? hear our Sabbath prayer, that, and it's all beautiful, and, they're thinking, may the Lord defend and protect you, and it's all, and, it's a romanticized version of what went on, but Jews built their life, particularly in Eastern Europe, centered their life around the Sabbath. That was their day of rest, as a sign of the covenant, as obligatory. Jews, for the most part, in Eastern Europe, didn't work on the Sabbath and observed it strictly. It's only later on, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, is described as the Shabbat Shabbaton, the Sabbath of Sabbaths. So in very early Reform in Germany, one of the leaders, and I'm blocking his name now, I can't remember who he was, it's told that he was, they stopped. They didn't, I'll say it this way, they didn't observe it the way Orthodox Jews observed Yom Kippur. They had their own way. And this particular rabbi, mind you, would sit at a coffee house. This is in the early days of Reform, like 1880, 1870, early days. I think early, I'd have to look this up. And would drink coffee and would recite what are called piyutim. Piyutim are medieval Jewish poems specifically, mostly directed at the high holy days. In very Orthodox circles, that's what makes the service very, very long, are these piyutim that are included, outpouring of the heart to God. So so that's a Reform. Here you have this very traditional thing that he's doing that we don't even do that today, but he's sitting having a cup of coffee and he's reading. That's the tension of Reform. That's the tension of it. That's an exaggeration, to be sure. That's an exaggeration. But there's some truth in that. And what I said about the Sabbath is that we all know that we're there to sanctify, and some will just do it more than others, and some will find their own way. And we leave it to each individual conscience to decide how they're going to observe the Sabbath. Okay. So as a parallel to this idea, a professor of mine at Viterbo University, when I was completing my master's degree in mental health counseling, and this is, I'm just making an analogy, you'll know when I make it, once said we were talking about how Freud is ignored today. Now it's, there's drugs, there's medication, there's all kinds of different therapies that don't emphasize Sigmund Freud at all. And we went through them, and he looked at the end of this presentation and he said, just remember, Freud is always in the room. So likewise, the Sabbath is always in the room for Jews, whether to be followed at various levels. I think that's more my opinion, or more my observation, but I think that ultimately that there is some truth to that. Okay. I'm going to just one last section, and then we'll stop because I'm seeing it's almost time. I want to conclude this section with what follows in Exodus 32. We just finished the conclusion of Exodus 31, and that is the construction of the tabernacle. For the juxtaposition between the end of Exodus 31, this Vishamru v'nei Yisrael, children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, and chapter 32, detailing how the tabernacle is to be constructed, is significant. So the sages, and when I say the sages, ask, I'm really looking at the Talmudic recording of this kind of passage, looking at the Talmud at 425 to 700 BCE. The sages ask, why is this passage regarding the Sabbath juxtaposed with the construction of the tabernacle? Doesn't seem to make much sense. We have the Sabbath, and now we're going to go right into building the tabernacle. They responded, because to remind that it is forbidden to construct the tabernacle on the Sabbath. So the Sabbath supersedes the building of a house of God. Did you need to, take a moment, wait,
Sorry.
okay?
Save in the Holy of Holies.
The Sabbath supersedes the building of a house of God. You can't violate the Sabbath in order to build a temple, build a synagogue. Right. So, then they asked the question, what type of activity was done in relation to the tabernacle? And their answer, as well as the oral law, the Torah Shel Baal Peh, the oral law, was that there are 39 different categories of work that had to be performed in order to build the tabernacle. These types of activities, whatever those activities are, that must be work. Because work isn't defined, right?
Mhm.
You shall cease from all your labors. What does that just mean? If I'm a farmer, I can't plow the field, but I can drive a car? Does it mean that what I do for a living, I can't do that, but I can do other activities? I can do gardening on the Sabbath. I can do other things. Well, the answer to that is no. No, the answer is no. Because work isn't defined by what you do to make a living, it's the nature of the activity itself. And these activities, whatever is done with reference to the construction of the tabernacle, that constitutes work. And thus, if any action falls within these different divisions of labor, any of the 39, they were and remain to this day in Orthodox circles prohibited. And to be clear, this is traditional Orthodox Judaism, and to a lesser extent, but to a significant extent, true in the conservative movement. The Reformed tradition has a different view of what constitutes holiness and work. So let me just give you one example, okay? And you're going to think, gee, that's kind of weird. So suppose I'm in my house, and I want to take my briefcase, and I want to carry my briefcase to my office. Oh no, say I want to take my briefcase to the temple. Is that work?
Are you already going to the temple?
Let's say I don't go very often. Let's say I don't, it's really not related to my work at all. It's not related to being around. I just have a briefcase. I got my music in it, okay? And I want to take that music, and they have a nice grand piano here, and I want to play the piano. And I can walk, okay? Not drive, I can walk.
Now you won't.
Well,
Does
I
that
say,
work?
why don't you play your grand piano at the house?
So how do I, well, let's
Thank you, Maggie.
let's pretend I don't have a grand piano, okay? Let's pretend, just for the hypothetical. Well, we could talk about musical instruments, that's another issue, okay? But we won't talk about that right now. So the answer to that question is no.
No.
Excuse me, the answer to that question is yes.
Yes.
That is work.
That's work.
Why? It's not because I'm sweating and perspiring. Say I live next door. It would still be work. Why? Because I'm taking an object from a private domain to a public domain. And in order for them to construct the tabernacle, people had to bring stuff. And they would bring stuff from their tent to the center where the tabernacle was being constructed. Therefore, that going from a private to a public domain would constitute work.
Now you
Okay.
can move.
Now, let me give you another example. Suppose I don't like where the grand piano is located. And let's say I'm not going to play the piano. Let's say there's a lock and I'm not going to play the keys on the piano on the Sabbath. Okay? And I just want to move the piano, but I'm going to do it by myself. And let's say I have a big, big living room, and I got to move furniture, I got to relocate furniture, and I'm going to work up a little bit of a sweat, and I'm going to push that because Maggie refuses to help me. She wants to do her thing. She's very meditative. She says, you want to do that? You do that on your own. So I push the piano, and I'm working up a big sweat. Is that work?
Yes.
No.
No,
No.
you're in your house.
I'm in my home. Now, is that in the spirit of the Sabbath?
No.
No. You're absolutely correct.
That's why I said no. 'cause
Yeah,
I didn't think
absolutely,
it was
because
the spirit.
that's not the purpose of the Sabbath. I'm supposed to cease from my work.
Right.
but it doesn't fall within the, I don't believe, again, and somebody may correct me, I don't believe that that falls in the category of work, because it doesn't fall within the 39 categories. The issue about the instrument, that's a little bit tricky, but we could talk about that some other time. But theoretically speaking, it doesn't violate the strict definition of work. It does violate, obviously, the spirit of the Sabbath.
Can I ask you a question?
Uh-huh.
Since you brought up music, say you are a pianist, but you're not a concert, you don't do it for your job.
Right.
You're in your house. Can you, on the Sabbath, play your piano?
That's a good question. The answer, if I'm an Orthodox Jew, I can't. If I'm a traditional Jew, if I really want to follow the 39 Melachot, if I want to leave the world alone, that's the basic underlying theory of the Remember the Creation.
It's like redoing art, you can't.
Well, that's drawing. That's, but playing a musical instrument, there is a danger that you could break the key, break a string, okay? And that you would come to fix the string, and tikkun on Shabbat, repair, is prohibited. I might come to work, so playing the musical instrument, not in the service, by the way.
Yeah,
that's
no,
a different.
I'm thinking
That's a
about
different problem about playing. Can you have musical instruments on the Sabbath? Can you play? Can I play my guitar? Gently, spiritually, in the course of a service. If I'm Orthodox, if I'm traditional, I can't do that. Why? Because they used to play music in the temple, and also this concept of breaking a string. There's two aspects to it. They used to play music in the temple. They used to have the lyre and play music. Now that the temple is destroyed, in remembrance of that, we no longer play musical instruments in the temple during the course of a service. Not prohibited outside of the service and on Shabbat. Maggie, you have your hand
I
up,
have
please.
a question. To a non-Jew, does this seem like a little out there?
No,
Just a little bit?
no.
Well,
Like a little bit
I would
too much?
I would say 40 years ago for me.
It seems like, come on. So I
Well,
break this string, I'm not gonna fix it,
Right.
right?
I would say 40 years ago, I would have thought it was a little out there. But
Okay.
knowing more about the Lord and about God and how it's a benefit for me,
Yeah.
then I'm more understanding.
That's helpful to me.
And
That's
other,
really helpful to me.
other cultures, for example, the Amish, Hutterites, and those people,
Right.
they observe their
They live
Sabbath
it.
very closely. And that's
Yeah.
also different from the Jewish faith.
Like you were talking about earlier, your consciousness of the Sabbath. Growing up as a Christian, even though we did not go to church all the time, I had a consciousness of
You
Sunday
knew it was
being
Sunday.
the Lord's day. And I still have that consciousness.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people nowadays
No.
don't.
They
It's
don't.
so different.
But we were raised that way.
Yeah.
And when you talk about, we used to have blue laws in the late 40s and 50s when I grew up.
Right, blue sky law.
The only place you could go to the
Me too.
drugstore there was only one appointed drugstore in Mobile, as I remember.
Yes,
And you remember that.
yes.
So,
That stayed open on Sundays.
Sunday.
I grew up in St. Louis, and I distinctly remember Sunday morning in particular. There wasn't a car on the street. You'd almost think you were in Jerusalem. The way,
I grew up in Southern California and I remember that.
yeah. Yeah.
But it does not bother me. It does not. I think it's great, personally.
It's interesting to have that perspective because sometimes, you hear about when people study the Talmud about so many angels on the head of a pin, and it's like it's taking it too far. As a Jew, I don't believe that it is.
Yeah.
But there's a part of me, a rational part of me that says, look, you're going to play the piano, you're not going to break a string, and if you did, you're not going to repair it.
I wouldn't know how. I wouldn't know how to
But
begin
And
with.
I would just be
Spirit.
thinking you're just playing it for your own enjoyment and to
Right.
get closer to God.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But the spirit
some,
of it, I
some people will say
understand.
that the way I play, I may be going the other way, but.
No, that's not true. You
That's
play
why you have
beautifully.
conservative, reformed, and
Yeah, exactly,
Orthodox.
exactly.
Besides, God said, make a joyful noise.
Well, there you go.
Thank
There you go. I'll just
That's
conclude
what
with
I
an
say.
anecdote, just an anecdote that I think, when I was growing up, we lived right above an Orthodox family of 4 generations. Let's see, did I have that right? 1, 2, 3, yeah, 4 generations. They lived in a 3-bedroom apartment, and they were Orthodox. They were all Orthodox, so. 2 of the generations came from Eastern Europe. They either survived the war or they came, and they kept Orthodox, and they wore their Orthodox. It was part of the fabric of their personality. It's just like what they did. They didn't, they weren't concerned about the 39 melachot. They knew how to keep the Sabbath and so forth and so on. But they had a weakness. And the weakness was the St. Louis Cardinals. Right? Because my weakness as well. And every Saturday afternoon,
Red
for some of the time,
changes.
I would go down, and what were they doing? They were watching the St. Louis Cardinals the afternoon. Harry Carey was the announcer back then. Crazy guy. Anyway, done very well by Will Ferrell. If you have not seen Will Ferrell's impersonation, go on YouTube, put Will Ferrell, Harry Carey, it's hysterical. Anyway, that's a side point. Anyway, how did they get around it? Because you can't turn on a TV, because you can't burn a fire, and turning on creates electricity, current, it warms up.
I know, because he didn't spot.
They had a timer.
Had a timer.
So that they would set the timer before the Sabbath, set the channel, just like preparing the house for Shabbat. They had their timer, and they would set it for like 2 o'clock in the afternoon when the ball game would come on, and the TV would turn on by the timer automatically, and they would watch the game, and they hadn't violated the Shabbat. Was it in the spirit of Shabbat?
No.
I would contend yes,
Yes.
because it gave them enjoyment. It gave them pleasure.
Relaxation.
They were observant to begin with. These people were very devoted to God. They went to shul in the morning and they came back.
But
They had Friday night dinners. Friday night dinners that they would have were very real. I mean, I used to go downstairs. They were very enjoyable. This was like just part of their Sabbath celebration. I mean, they wouldn't see it that way, believe me.
Right.
But I never had a sense as a little boy going down there that they were violating, hypocrites or anything like that. It was just part. And so you take modernity, you kind of work with it, and even among the Orthodox. And you were saying in
In
Sfat?
Israel, they did not TV because nobody was in Sfat, where I lived, which was ultra-Orthodox. There's no television, there's no nothing. Any time of the week, it doesn't matter whether it's Shabbat or not. But they would use timers to turn off the lights so the kids could go to sleep at night. Because they had all the lights on. And so they used timers for that sort of thing.
Yeah. So you see, there are ways, it's kind of like this, okay? And then we should really stop this, but hopefully the people watching this say, okay, that's enough, and we'll turn this off. But this is, this is.
It's interesting.
Yeah,
I lost
my
my train of-
oven had a Shabbat
Yeah.
cycle. You turn it on before the
Have you ever
Sabbath,
seen?
and it would stay on
Yeah.
a certain temperature, like
Yeah.
250 or something,
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
right.
it's-
for 3 days.
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
Have you ever seen a Shabbat elevator?
No.
There is such a thing. Tell
There
them.
is. Yeah, see, if
It
the
stops at every
elevator
floor.
stops on its own,
Oh, is it those that you step in and you're going up?
and it's doing it
in
all
a
by
big
itself,
circle.
you're
It
not
just
pressing any
stops
buttons.
at every floor.
It stops at every floor.
So
You
you
can
just
take
get
the
out or
elevator, why?
in.
Because you're not getting any benefit
You're
from it.
not pushing
Only
buttons.
from the standpoint, why? Because you're not pushing any button.
Mm.
And it's not stopping for you, it's gonna stop at all
So
of
they
it.
have them in all the hotels in Israel.
Yeah, yeah, for Orthodox people. You know what, it's similar to, this isn't the same, but this is a different one. I was invited over to somebody's house for dinner, and there was a very traditional, very Orthodox man that was there, and he somehow had worked out eating at this person's house. She didn't keep strictly kosher, but she made sure that he had paper plates and that the food itself had the OU she bought from the kosher butcher, blah, 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 blah. So we got into this discussion about bacos, right? You know, the artificial
Yeah.
bacon.
Oh,
Yeah, that you put on a
will eat
salad.
'em. I will eat 'em.
Betty Crocker Bacos have an OU on it. And OU stands for Union of Orthodox.
That means you can eat
The-
'em.
100% kosher. 100%. They wouldn't put their seal on if it wasn't.
They're not
100%
bacon.
kosher.
no, they're not. It's artificial.
As a Reformed Jew
I can't
and
eat
as a
it.
conservative Jew, I was troubled by it. I said, you're kind of getting around.
I
The
can't eat 'em.
The Orthodox Jew,
I don't like them. I don't think they taste
well,
good.
yeah, the Orthodox Jew said, I have no problem with that. It's soy. For him, it was a black and white issue. It was like,
Yeah.
well, I don't care about
And for
appearances.
me, it's just
you know.
the sound of its bacon.
Yeah,
I was gonna say,
Yeah.
do you even eat bacon?
No.
yeah. You know, well, I'm worried about my position as a rabbi if I would have people over, guests over, and I would put bacos on that, even though it's OU, even though
We
it's
don't
strictly
do
kosher,
soy.
it could give the impression that I mean,
Abstain from
yeah,
eating.
there are many Reformed rabbis. There are many Reformed rabbis, and
We
there
eat
are,
shrimp.
yeah, they'll eat shrimp for lots of reasons that we'll talk about later on when we talk about the different denominations and how they view things and so forth.
They don't even
In the
think
Reformed
about it.
tradition, not so much now, but for a long, long period of time, they disregarded dietary laws because they didn't see the spirituality. They didn't see they thought those were ancient customs that did not elevate the spirit, did not elevate.
But who changed that law? It's in God's word.
Well, I would say this, that in Reformed Judaism, it's permissible to regard the Torah as being written by human beings over a period of time and
That's
redacted.
okay, so
And
you're
therefore,
back to
since
your
it doesn't
original
have
JUPD.
The theological authority, the literal theological authority, it's going to speak to them in different ways. And they're going to say that that was written in a certain time and place, and we have, they can make this argument, evolved into something different. Those laws, while maybe important during those times, not putting them down, but in today's world, and I think that some of the liberalism that you see in American society is a result of, Reformed Protestant liberalism as well as Jewish liberalism.
See,
A
I
liberal
consider
attitude
myself
and acceptance of
And I lived Orthodox when I was in Israel.
of people and of things that are addressed in the Torah that could be a problem. And you see, particularly if you regard it as the literal word of God
Yeah.
and not the closer you are to a fundamentalist reading, in some respects, not in all respects, but in some respects, you're going to resist integrating current societal values into your faith.
That's why he's such a perfect rabbi. I'm not just saying that because I'm married to him. But he is able to walk those bridges where I tend to be a little bit stiffer.
I've always said this. I've always said this about.
It says.
Thank you all very much for coming online. For those who did, and I'm going to sign off now. Okay.